Hi. So this is to do with falling in love with architecture. I'm making this series of videos. It's not fully structured. There is an introductory video which you can refer to, which is the first of the lot in case you want to know what this particular series of videos is all about. My name is Abu Francis, and I'm an architect, and I'm also a guy who wrote a design software. This talks about various points about architecture which will help you understand it, fall in love with it. These are not very detailed videos where you need to get all the instructions. You'll get some idea about some points which you may find interesting to further pursue. In this particular video, I'm going to talk about three important points, which you can say that these are the three unique points about architecture. One is that it is all encompassing. All encompassing. It is like you're completely inside it. In fact, it's something like love itself. When you are in love with somebody, you are so involved with that person. You are that person is completely in your mind all the time, and you are engage with that, like, is that person happy, how is he, and so on and so forth. So you can even say that that person is all encompassing you, covers you completely. Now that is usually a metaphor, but in case of architecture, it is not really a metaphor. You are inside some architecture or the other. There is no escaping that. So even if you are outside in nature, you can say that, oh, thank goodness, now I'm no longer in architecture. No, you're still inside some architecture, which is which you'll come to know once I talk about the second point. So architecture is always going to be there, and you are going to be physically inside it all the time, for sure. And there's not a single person. Why person? There's not a single organism. And why an organism? There's not a single material on this world, in this universe, which is not encompassed inside architecture. So that makes it pretty interesting, right? That this is a subject which is not like, say, let's say, uh, gynecology. Now, a male can lead his entire life without ever visiting a gynecologist, for sure. There are many males who have never visited a gynecologist or never got involved in that subject. Uh, a gynecologist would be involved in that subject, and there will be times when that gynecologist is not involved in that subject. Like that doctor comes home. My eldest daughter is a gynecologist, so she's not going to be a gynecologist all the time. She plays the role of a gynecologist because she's trained as a gynecologist. But there will be times when she comes home, she's my daughter, we interact. But architecture is not like that. Architecture is one subject which you will be dealing with every instance of your life, not just your life as if you're an architect, but everybody's life. That's why it's all encompassing. So it's not really a metaphor. When it becomes a metaphor, you say that there's a very passionate mathematician, and that mathematician sees maths everywhere. He sees this bottle of jam, he say there's maths in that. You see this fork over here, you say there's maths in that. Yeah, so for that particular mathematician, that subject is quite encompassing. He's obsessed by it, he's in love with it. But here, I'm not talking about a metaphor. You are inside architecture. Physically, you are there. And you're going to be there inside that architecture. It is really a very, very, what do you say, humbling thought. Or maybe not humbling, it's probably a modest thought that My God, the subject is so amazing. It is just covers you all the time, not just you, everybody. There's not a single person who can escape from it. I think I am repeating myself. The second thing about architecture is that it deals with the rarest of raw material. Now, this flummoxes a lot of people. Strange, I thought it is pretty obvious. What does an architect do? What does the subject deal with? Like we just spoke about mathematics, so mathematics talks about abstractions and symbols and digits and number systems and mathematical operations. How do you multiply? How do you subtract? All kinds of things. So you can say the ingredients would be those symbols and those operations, mathematical operations. Uh, the gynecologist has got her subject, and there are certain ingredients she'll have to deal with. A neuroscientist will talk about the brain, and so he'll have his surgical tools and whatever he uses to get that brain surgery done. Uh, a carpenter will have his various tools of the trade, and he'll use raw material like wood, pieces of wood, and then carve that and saw that and plane it and make furniture or whatever it is. So his raw material is that stuff. What is the raw material of an architect, and what is that raw material which is so blessedly rare? Now, when a material is rare, it means that to get that material is very difficult. That is one way to look at it. It's very difficult to get that material. But there's another way to look at it is that it's very difficult to create that material. And once you consume it to get the next set, you have to really struggle. Like gold, for example. I mean, it's really difficult to extract gold, and you can hoard a little bit of that gold for yourself. And then now, when you want more, you'll have to do more work for that. Diamonds, you have to go and quarry it. Though some people say that diamond is actually not so very rare. It's the Beers family of South Africa. There's some story about that. Let me not digress. So diamonds or gold, or there are many rare earths. There are certain minerals which are very difficult to get and very difficult to replenish. So if you look at the word that something is rare, that if you happen to destroy it, then to get it back is really difficult. So you pause this video for a moment and ask yourself, what is that one thing which all architects deal with uniformly, invariably, when that architect comes up with a piece of architecture? He has consumed that particular material. And once that material is consumed, that material is so rare that you really cannot even create it. There's only a certain amount of quantum of that material available. Just pause this video and ask yourself, what is that thing which could be that material which architects deal with? But yes, architects do deal with the rarest of rare raw material. Okay, if you have come back here after pausing and thinking what could be, so let me reveal to you what an architect does. Now, when I use the word architect, I am not only talking about trained architects like me and other colleagues of mine who are trained in this subject, but I'm also talking about anybody who is so deeply involved. I told you just now in the first point that it's so encompassing that people are deeply involved in architecture. And there are some non-trained architects who could actually be practicing architects. Now, this is a controversial subject in India, especially. But what I meant here is that people may have the capacity to undertake the profession of architecture for various XYZ reasons. Recently, a very famous non-architect who did a pretty good architectural work, he expired, Satish Gujral. He's trained as a sculptor, but he is known for his architectural works, and he got some very important commissions. And he's actually not an architect. So I'm covering all kinds of architects, a villager who makes his own house, designs his own house because he can't afford to employ an architect. He's also technically, let us be gracious, he's also an architect. Now, all these people are actually consuming this rare raw material. And what is that? That material is actually space. Now, can we look at space as a material? Space, the space which we are in, is a material. Now, that's little absurd, right? Actually, it's not. If you really look at the number system, for example, people will say, okay, here is one Apple pencil, here is one fork, here are two things, or you can say, here are two forks. So you kind of associate set theory where you say one item in that set is the number one, two items in that set is a number two, and that is a very easy to understand way to understand the number system in mathematics, because you relate it to these things which are to be counted. But how do you represent zero? Nothing is zero. I mean, there's nothing in that set. It's an empty set. But what is that empty set? I can't handle that empty set. I can't touch it. I can touch two forks. I can say this represents two. But what represents zero? There's nothing which represents zero, right? So zero is not something which is got a direct connection with the real world around us. But we still agree that it is a number. So if you look at this way of looking at it, I am saying that space is that material which an architect consumes, because he decides that in this space I'm going to use this part of the space and fill it with material. That's how you get a wall over there, for example, and this material another wall there, and then I won't consume any material here, I won't place any material into that volume there, and then you get a window over there. This is what an architect does. So eventually, when an architect gets a project and there is this parcel of land and there's this volume of space on top of that land, that architect is thinking, okay, how do I consume what of that space? Now, you cannot consume the entire space, right? I mean, you can't fill it up with material. That doesn't happen, but you still do consume, and you elect to say that this part of the space I will fill it with brickwork or concrete or steel or whatever material, physical material you use, but this part I will leave alone. Your mind did go to that volume of space and you left it alone. And this is very rare material, right? In the sense that once you did that and the building is up there, well, you can't make another building over there, right? It is the spatial volume can be consumed only once. If you made a brick wall over there, one part of the space, that brick wall will be there, maybe for centuries sometimes, for thousands of years sometimes. In Egypt, they went and made a pyramid over there, and there are some voids and all inside the pyramid, but that particular spatial space is consumed practically for 5,000, 6,000 years. It's consumed. If you want to release that space once again to be reused for something else, then you have to actually demolish whatever which the physical material which is there, and the space comes back. Space can never be destroyed. It can never be created. There is no way to create that space. Therefore, an architect actually deals with a very rare raw material. And this, why am I pointing this out, is because there's a lot of casualness with some architects and some architecture students. And in the real world also, people say, yeah, what, like you make some buildings. Okay, fine, you make a building, I'll go and stay there. No, that particular building which came up there came up in that little sliver of space around the Mother Earth. That little sliver of space, if you look at it from the universe point of view, we're a tiny little dot over there somewhere inside, hanging inside this universe. And there's a little sliver of space which is habitable. There's some air there, there's some oxygen there. Unfortunately, that has got coronavirus nowadays, and therefore we have to protect ourselves. So that volume of space, you better treat it very respectfully, because once you invade some parts of it, then you are effectively locked in whatever which is there in between those parts also. If I make four walls and I didn't consume that particular space inside this, it's very difficult to create a say another room inside that earlier room which is there, right? So you need to understand we are dealing with the rarest of rare raw material, and that's a very good reason to fall in love with the subject, that you are doing something very holy, very noble, very, very important. As an architect, you are really getting into understanding how do you handle that. The third part actually stems, if you really were to relate to it, it actually stems from the first two. Now, this can be a little controversial. People will say, what am I talking about? I'm stating here that criticism of architecture is pointless. Now, that's crazy, right? I mean, and you can criticize anything, right? I mean, it's an act of intellect. An architect is given a commission, he goes and designs a building, he or she, whatever the case may be, and that building is out there. Are you trying to say that you cannot criticize it? What I'm saying specifically is that if you do decide to criticize it, a lot of that criticism is actually pretty pointless. It sounds very blunt, right? I mean, it sounds crude that why should I not criticize a building? Now, how does somebody improve? You can criticize a poem. You can say that this poem is whatever the literature experts will say, that the syntax is not right or the rhyming is not right or whatever the way they look at that poem. A mathematical theorem can be criticized. You say, oh no, this is not a theorem. This has got a flaw here. This doesn't work like this. But now I'm saying that if you talk something about a building and then you say this is right about it or this is wrong about it, and I'm saying it's really pointless. Why? The reason is that once that building is out there, it has already consumed all that particular part of that space, and built matter and everything is there. I'll talk a little bit more about it in another lecture. But what you really do, why do we take some part of the space and fill it with built material, and some part we leave it alone? And there's a very interesting lesson there. Why does an architect do that? So, but why can't we criticize that? That building is out there. It needs to be criticized. You need to say that, this building is not nice or it is really nice, whatever the case may be. Basically, criticism I mean by taking a very critical look with the act of leaving some lessons for the future. Now, yes, you can leave lessons for the future. But once that building is out there, it has already consumed that rare material. It's very difficult to retrieve that material anymore. Space has already got consumed. In parts, all right. But even in the parts which is not got consumed, you left it alone and you left it as space itself. That is not further usable. You cannot make a house inside a room, for example. So effectively, you've consumed that thing, the deed is done, and the most important part is that there is no alternative to that thing. Now, a criticism becomes what's the opposite of pointless? Pointful. A criticism is useful and not pointless when you say that, this is wrong, this is what should have been. But we don't have that second thing there. We have only that one thing, it's that building over there, nothing else. So what is the point of criticizing? The other thing which you're comparing it with is like one of those politician talks, like maybe when I was elected, I would have done that like this. Who knows? So comparing something which is existing in the real world with what is a theory, it's unbalanced. So you got something which is out there in the real world, and then you're criticizing it. Oh, that building is not like this. That window should not have been like that. The door is not right, or whatever the thing. You can crib, okay? I'm not talking about people making disparaging comments and saying, oh, this is not nice or whatever. That's not the point. The point is that whatever you criticize, it really goes nowhere. That's the honest truth. I mean, there are books, there are, I think, even courses which talks about architectural criticism, but there is an area in which criticism is valid, but that's not in the product. I'm talking about architecture as the product, but architectural design process can be criticized, but that's a different subject. And I am pretty involved in that area because I wrote a software for designing of architecture, and I wrote that software specifically because architectural design process needs to be formally criticized. But the product, the process leads to a product. A process leads to a product. In case of architecture, this product is very unique and there's no alternative for it. It's already there, it's consumed that space. The process can be criticized, but the product criticism goes nowhere. I've read criticism about. In fact, one of the papers which get circulated around, people seem to be downloading my theoretical works. I've got a review of a book about Corbusier's works, and honestly, I was not very convinced whether all that criticism about Corbusier will really is that any way to really understand that work. God only knows what really. How do you criticize something which is unique? It is very similar to you meet a person, okay, and that person is very dear to you, and then you start discovering some flaws. Okay, he doesn't wear mask during corona crisis or whatever. Okay, or he's got a tendency to give some ugly words when he's very tensed up, whatever. And then you wonder, like, why can't he change that? But you can't. He's that person. He's got his own way of doing it. There's no alternative to that person. That person is very unique. Once that person is unique, you can crib, you can suggest to him. I mean, you can't suggest to a building, please change, that door, please change. So I don't want to really continue so much with this analogy. Let me give you a better analogy. When I was a kid, in my native place, there was this cute little company. They were a soap making company, and I used to go and watch them make soap over there. And it was a semi-manual, semi-automated process. They had some few machinery, and they used to make this, big chunks of soap. And they had this nice wire cutter. It's very fascinating for a kid to see the wire cutter cutting those slabs of soap and making little small cakes. And then somebody sits in one corner and he was wrapping up those soap. After a few years, those poor people, they had to discontinue. That factory didn't succeed. What happens is that when you make that soap and that soap is put on some shelf at some store, that soap is not a unique soap. There are other soaps which are competing with that soap. So when somebody goes over there and he sees this soap and then he sees another soap, in that same time frame, there are two things available which can substitute one for the other. That doesn't happen with architecture. You cannot stand in front of a building with a remote and say, okay, I don't like this piece of architecture. Give me another one. Oh, okay, this one is nice. You see what's happening today on the internet. You hear or read some piece of news, and then you see this HTTPS or whatever on some website, and then go read that this thing happened and that thing happened, and then you wonder, oh, that's what happened. But then somebody comes and says, the same incident which you read over there, it's actually, this was the reason. Then you have another alternative in that same time frame. And then now you have two different pieces of news, and you can discard one and see the other. That is called criticism, because there's a usefulness over there. You can select to choose whichever you want. But architectural criticism goes nowhere of this nature. Okay, when you're criticizing the product. If you're criticizing the process, well, that's a very important discussion, and that's a very detailed discussion. But since this video is about falling in love with architecture, I just thought as I introduce the subject, we need to know these 3 points. Now you may wonder, what is the point of telling that criticism is pointless. Okay, that's a new page which I've opened. Why should this be a point, and why should you fall in love with architecture? So, at this point, let me personify architecture. Here is the potential for you. I personified architecture with a person, right, some time back. And I said that if you met a person who's really very nice, but had some few bad qualities, and all you can do is, because that guy is already grown up, he's not a kid anymore, all you can do is to crib and say, you know what, I don't like the way you are behaving like this. But you're not God. Maybe your interpretation of what that person was doing was wrong. Maybe he had a very good reason for doing whatever he did, which you found pretty bad. So if you look at architecture like that, that here is something which is a product of creation, a real careful thought and sensitivity to the world and a thin sliver of space and all that, and you know that that space can't be, recovered very easily. You have to demolish that building and recover that space once again because you can't create space. Okay, now what happens? Then you come to this point that how do I criticize this? So if you become sensitized to this fact, two things will happen. One is you are not going to go scot free. You will own up to the responsibility of designing something very important over there. One of the reason I kind of temporarily suspended my practice is because I realized that I've been not effective in utilizing the knowledge which I have. And that's a separate story, and there's a lot to say over there. What happens is, suppose I kind of draw this grid which says that this is a boundary of responsibility which an architect has, and he should make sure that he is within that particular boundary. He adheres to all the ethical practices and everything. But unfortunately, there is a gap in this boundary. And many, which is this gap of criticism, many architects, what they do, they slip out. And they don't really adhere to the real ethical practices there. And they go and design a building, knowing very well that once a building is out there, you can criticize for what till the cows come home. I don't care. You better deal with it. I've done my job. I'm going away. And this is not probably expressed like this. No architect would want to express it like that. But that's what, honestly, the very, very brutal, candid truth is, that because architecture as a product is not very easily criticizable, and if you do criticize it, you really can say that that's your opinion. I don't think that criticism is valid, and I have this justification or that justification. And you'll find a lot of architects full of justifications about why their building is nice, even though the real public is really fed up with that building. So I don't want that to happen. So one is that you will own up to that particular responsibility. You know that it can't be criticized. So let's not fool anybody. Let us be doubly sure about what is that particular project and how will it come up over there. The second reason why I'm pointing out that architecture is not really criticizable is because I want you to draw to the attention to the part where it is criticizable. It is talk, you can talk about that. And this part is also not really much in today's architectural literature. Now, I'm sorry, I'm making this a little pedantic and very pontifying kind of lecture. What I meant is that if you really want to do a good job of defining what you are as an architect, then you need to really understand which is the part. I told you that some process leads to a product. So what I'm trying to say is that I agree that criticizing a product is pointless. Let's really criticize the process. Let's really figure out how to criticize the process. Let's catch ourselves. Let's catch our own excuses. We are falling in love with this subject, and we really need to be very, very respectful to somebody or something we are in love with. So this is my introduction. to architecture, three unique points. It's all encompassing, it deals with the rarest of rare raw material, and criticism of the final product is quite pointless. Thank you so much.